Since time is short, and I hope you don't mind, while you're eating, we'll get started. We have a large and distinguished panel, and time is short, so we would like to get started if you don't mind. First, I'd like to thank the panel and our partner, ORF, for providing this opportunity to think about the Asia century and the role that think tanks might play in helping shape that future. I'm the director of the Think Tanks and Civil Societies program at the University of Pennsylvania, and I just want to point out that there are 8,000 think tanks around the world, and the most explosive growth is taking place in Asia. Not all of it even, not all of it good, but there is a tremendous interest in governments and in civil society in creating think tanks. In terms of this discussion, it's also important to point out that in times of crisis, either after a war or just before, or in terms of economic collapse, or 9/11, the data that I've collected over the years shows that there is a surge in new think tanks in periods of transition, in periods of crisis. And so the question is, why is that? You may have some answers, and we can discuss that during the Q&A. But the reality is that it generally is that the conventional wisdom, the way of approaching policy issues did not work and needs new and fresh ideas and approaches. I believe we, in terms of the context of this Raisina Dialogue and the moment that we are in history, we are at a similar moment of transition that requires a change in the way we approach things. And this panel will focus on what are the new paradigms, what are the new policies, what are the new business models that are required to help understand, help shape what is now the Asian century. The panel is comprised of both domestic and foreign policy think tanks, and a range of organizational models or types in terms of think tanks. So it'll be a rich discussion in terms of both in terms of the domestic and foreign policy challenges that shape our future. A few opening remarks. I think that there's been much discussion at these dialogues about the Fourth Industrial Revolution and learning from history, and that the previous industrial revolutions should inform our actions. I think that history does repeat itself, but differently. And I think that with what we are faced today, it will be fundamentally different and will present greater challenges for a number of reasons. One is, I think, that the rate of change, the ceaseless advances in technology will accelerate change and will have a direct impact on public policy, or what I call the increased velocity of information and policy flows. Technology makes that possible, and that impacts public policy. Additionally, I think we are seeing, and there is very ample evidence, and for those who think that the moments in terms of populism, nationalism, nativism, and protectionism, which has also been discussed extensively at these meetings, is something that will pass. I would suggest that we need to think again. I think we are just seeing the tip of the iceberg of that, and that we will see over the next couple years increased fragmentation within political parties, increased polarization in both the electorate and politics, and an increase in disinformation and misinformation. And so this requires, and in times of transition, both the public and policymakers have turned to think tanks to help them think about these challenges and how to shape policy. So we will begin the discussion, and I've asked each of the panelists to share with you some, in the first round, policies and paradigms, new policies and paradigms that they believe need to be considered in this new brave world that we're in. So I'm going to go down the line in terms of the panelists and ask them to just make a few comments on new policies and paradigms that they think we should consider.
Hello, my name is Cameron Munter. I'll give you a quick story and then two ideas, two thoughts for you to try to kick off the discussion. I was previously the American ambassador in Pakistan at the time of the bin Laden raid, and I realized that when we did that, my public health portfolio, that as a government leader, spending a lot of money to eradicate polio, had a little bit of trouble because of the role of a health worker in the bin Laden raid. We became less effective, let's put it this way, as a government. When I left government and began to work for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I realized that they would put together their non-governmental approach to polio eradication, which took on a lot of creative, global, and anticipatory elements. And to make a long story short, it's likely that polio will be eliminated from Pakistan and Afghanistan by the end of next year. I mention this because I don't want to come in and say, because we are talking about the third sector, that the Westphalian period is over, that governments are done, and that there isn't a role for governments. So this first illustration would be, it is in partnership with governments that most think tanks must work. For think tanks to think of themselves as utterly devoid of contact, I think is not going to be effective. It's going to be the question of whether the relationship with governments in years to come throughout this region is going to be healthy or whether it's going to be difficult. The 2 points I want to mention are simply ones I alluded to before. One is the global element of the work we do. At my current think tank in New York called the East-West Institute, we have a board which is half Americans and half non-Americans. This kind of diversity allows us a certain kind, not so much of nonpartisanship, but of multi-partisanship. If you can't fight among your board, and if you can't fight among the people who work with you, you're not going to get together and be able to expand your approach to different kinds of issues. And so a very global approach, a non-cramped approach, and getting away from the notion that a think tank is something that serves simply as an auxiliary to a foreign ministry, say, in foreign affairs, is going to be, I think, crucial. Something that I believe that these new think tanks that James has referred to can learn from some of the mistakes that in the Anglo-Saxon world that we've made, where they've been somewhat too cramped in their focus. So global context and global participation, the participants must themselves be mixed. The second point, my last point that I would make for this introduction, would be the idea of anticipatory work. That is to say, it's sometimes thought that when you're in a think tank, that you're responding to the deeds of the day, that my colleagues at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, or Brookings, or Carnegie, are writing books because they see a problem, and they're responding to that problem. I think people are coming to the conclusion that that simply isn't enough. The question, any government can do that, but the question is anticipating a problem before it happens. Building the relationships before those relationships are necessary is going to be one of the key elements I would posit that my colleagues would feel. You want to be out in front of the issues. So if you're talking about the Indo-Pacific strategic relationships, it's not enough to say, look at what America and China are doing. It's much more that you've got to say, as one of the speakers earlier said, what will Indonesia be in 10, 15, 20 years? And with whom will we be working in Indonesia to anticipate what the ideas of this whole, say, security arrangement might be. So my point is that if you are not global, if you are not mixed, you're going to lose out on the frictions of the way that a responsible think tank, I think, will work. And indeed, if you're not casting the intellectual exercise as one of anticipation rather than as one of reaction, I think you're going to fall behind. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim, you spoke of the global moment that we are in, and I think that India in particular is in a particularly unique position in this larger global moment, where on the one hand, we're still struggling with 19th century problems. 50% of kids coming out of Standard 2 in India coming out of Standard 5 can barely read a Standard 2 text. And at the same time, the global pace of change, technological change, is fundamentally altering the workspace. And so we are in India at this moment struggling with the 19th century challenge of ensuring that we have a largely literate and educated population, as well as trying to struggle with the question of what education should look like, given that the economy is going to go through this massive transformation. And you look at this across every sector. India is rapidly urbanizing, but urbanization cannot take place in the way in which urbanization has taken place all across the globe, particularly in the Western world, because the economy is transitioning. The nature of work is going through a fundamental change, which means the nature of our cities is going to start looking very different, and that transformation is taking place in the context of a large global environmental challenge. So the kinds of energy decisions we make today, India needs to rapidly enhance its energy needs in order to meet the needs of its growing economy. But we have to do this in a way that is sustainable, that is inclusive. In some senses, the kinds of progress that India is going through at this point is extremely unique because it is a process of change that cannot adopt models that the West has adopted. It has to be organic, it has to be unique, and it has to respond to the fact that these transformations are taking place in a moment of global change and global disruption. In essence, then, I think India is looking for a new development deal, a new way of thinking about its economic challenges, a new way of thinking about its social challenges in this larger political context. And it's there that I think tanks are beginning to play and ought to play a very, very significant role. Three specific points. One, India has one of its many challenges, a university system that is frankly at this point quite broken. So think tanks are actually filling the void of ideas in ways that you may not find in many other parts of the world. The space of knowledge generation and idea generation is very much a domain that think tanks in India occupy because of the nature of our university system. It's changing, it's disruptive at this point in time, but there is a very critical role that that think tanks are playing in that space of ideas. Secondly, India is going through all of these rapid transformations that are very different to any other economy around the globe at a moment in which its own state capacity is significantly weak. The Indian state struggles to even provide the most basic services. You just have to step out of this five-star hotel to see the difficulties that the Indian state has in ensuring that it gives its citizens high-quality basic civic services, sanitation, electricity, and so on and so forth. The capacity of the state is weak to get the everyday functions right. Therefore, the capacity of the state to think long-term is even weaker. And it is in that context that we have a very important complementary role to play with the state, both in engaging with its nitty-gritties, nuts and bolts of what it takes to strengthen the administration to get the basics right, and to be able to think long-term. But that long-term thinking also has to be done keeping in mind a very conscious and important role that think tanks have to play, which is, I believe, in speaking truth to power. In the context of a politics that is increasingly getting populist, that where nativism is taking over, the role of us as academics, as knowledge producers, it's critical for us to speak truth to power and engage in a public debate that is anchored in argument and anchored in evidence and not anchored in ideology and rhetoric. That's a very difficult role to play, especially if you have a complementary relationship with government, but it is one that as think tanks, I believe, we must ensure we hold on to. And how you do that gets even more complex in the context of a larger economy where basic survival also requires funding that throws open sets of questions on how we ensure we keep the integrity of our work and the rigor of our work alive.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Jim. So I'm Hervé Lamieux. I'm based in Sydney. I work for an international policy think tank called the Lowy Institute. Prior to that, I was based in London, working for another think tank, the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And it struck me that actually in thinking about the framing of this session, I fully agree with what Jim said, which was that the proliferation of think tanks, when you think about when think tanks were created, they tend to have been created in areas or times of profound political dislocation, questioning of orthodox assumptions, movements towards new institutions. And so when you think about the initial think tanks, which is, they were set up about 100 years ago now, very much in the tradition of Wilsonian liberal internationalism. This was a very Anglospheric concept, initially just exclusive to DC and London. And then we move into, obviously they had to deal with the failure of the League of Nations, the establishment of the United Nations, in which those institutions were actually very critical in terms of providing ideas for this new architecture post-World War II. Moving into the Cold War, the IISS was founded in London in the midst of the challenge of how you control or how you seek to, in some way, establish some predictability over the military balance of power between the Soviet Union and the United States, nuclear deterrence, conventional deterrence, and so forth. And then I think there was a proliferation, a third wave, post-Cold War, where we saw a whole host of new institutions whose core purpose seemed to be about managing globalization. And I think in retrospect, maybe we were a little bit naive as well in terms of our hopes and aspirations for managing globalization, in that we focused too much on the sort of aggregating positive effects of globalization, too little on the disaggregating negative effects of globalization, at least in certain countries of the West. So I think we're into a fourth period for think tanks now, where we really have to, again, reevaluate what our core purpose is, what is it that we're seeking to accomplish. There is obviously a diffuse grouping of think tanks with different missions, but every era has its zeitgeist, and I think ours is being challenged. And one of the challenges comes in the fact that our independence is being challenged, perhaps more as a matter of perception, and that has to do with trust deficits. Think tanks have always been viewed as elite institutions, insofar as there's been an enormous backlash against elite institutions. I think think tanks have also fallen victim to that. Partly that's not always our doing, but partly I think we also have to accept some ownership in how you make research more accessible, how you diversify our constituency, both in terms of who produces the research, but who we also aim to broadcast the research to. I think the other challenge is in terms of competition and disruption. There are many more hybrid think tanks out there nowadays, coming from the likes of big papers, big newspapers like the Financial Times or The Economist that have started their own analysis units, or NGOs as well that have really emerged from the margins and occupied a center ground. And that again reflects the kind of shifting politics in the West, where people have become disillusioned with orthodox political parties, but they're still very much impassioned by single issue topics, and so NGOs have really filled that gap. And then finally, the communication technology disruption has really changed the context in which government both considers but also delivers policy. Think tanks were set up in a day where you could essentially hope to influence policy through trickle-down means, through targeted approaches to government. Now governments want publics to be on side, and so think tanks have had to really think about how do you engage a wider constituency, not just government policymakers, but seek to in some way engage a larger public, and in that way show that you have mass or critical mass that can translate into policy making decisions. So the solutions, I think one is we need to double down on our core purpose, which is really to infuse political debate with analysis based on facts and expertise. I don't think that the need for that has diminished. To the contrary, I think that we need a healthy antidote to the alarmism that we're getting, the short horizons that increasingly the 24-hour news cycle produces. We need that kind of dispassionate long-term horizon analysis. That's not something that's going to disappear. we need to engage the public. So that's different constituencies, not just the policy-making crowd, but we need to regain the trust and legitimacy of the public. That's a big issue for all think tanks, I would imagine. And one way of doing that is really reasserting our intellectual independence, so questioning orthodoxy, questioning governments as well. Again, more in a sort of dispassionate way, and in a fact-based way, but that is also the way in which we reassert ourselves. And then finally, I would venture to say that in some sense, if there is a common purpose between Asian think tanks, which have really proliferated in the last 2 decades, and Western think tanks that have existed for some time, it is that we need to sort of acknowledge that Western-led institutions, Western-led either implicitly or explicitly, will no longer hold going forward with a world reordered, that we will need to find some form of bridging common purpose with Asian think tanks, and I think if there is one, it has to do with mitigating zero-sum politics. We need to think big, we need to think back to the original founders of the think tanks a century ago, the way that they proposed new institutions like the United Nations. Perhaps that is also something that we should also consider more of, moving into a very turbulent period.
Okay, thank you. I just want to take off from there to say that in some way, in developing countries, we are still competing with, for instance, the kind of think tanks that institutions or even magazines like The Economist have set up. So the analysis we do has to work and be better than what consulting groups and, well-established institutions, Western institutions, in fact, are putting forth. One way of doing that is, of course, to be looking at issues that are of great significance to us in India, but which fall through the cracks in the research that is being done elsewhere. So I want to make 2 points here. One is that, everyone will remember that when the Americans invaded Iraq, there was a lot of resistance from Germany and France, which did not go along. And at that time, the then President Bush said that, well, it's a coalition of the willing. And everybody laughed and said, what does that mean, a coalition of the willing? And NATO isn't going along, long-standing allies of the Americans aren't going along. But actually today we are in a world of coalitions of the willing. It is actually redefining what alliances and old forms of security treaties meant. So actually, while this may be tough on countries that got used to being allies, particularly in the Western alliance system, it actually has opened up a space for everybody else who wants to align their policies or lean towards, but not be an ally, not be tied into an arrangement, a sort of coalition of the willing, depending on the issues in question. I think that for India, one of the things we need to examine is the fact that for a long time, the population has seen itself as democratic, has been leaning towards the West, partly because, the elites are Western educated, we have strong people-to-people relationships, but the governments have always resisted that. It's much easier now for a government to say which way it leans, because that is the way its people have leant for quite a long time. The second parallel thing, which I think we should be studying more of from think tanks, is that, even as these new alignments have become possible, the old regional organizations or the existing regional organizations are actually fragmenting, or if not fragmenting, they're at least loosening up. So for instance, Brexit is actually a case of the European Union changing its composition because one country felt too tied down in that. Now, what we should be looking at is what is the effect of that on the European Union, which also has within it, even after Brexit, 2 blocks already. One is the 16+1, which is looking at China for investment. And then there are the older members, the original members of the European Union, which are reconsidering even their the sort of commercial engagement that they have had with China and how they want it to proceed. Actually, if you look nearer home, India has decoupled from SAARC. Within ASEAN, there is a loosening up of the relationships. This has a meaning for security, for economic relations, but the impact of that on members, or as Ambassador Munster said, what will Indonesia be like now that ASEAN has loosened up, now that it is no longer as unified as it was? And similarly for us, it's interesting to see what will happen to countries in our own neighborhood as SAARC transmutes itself into other organizations, whether this is BIMSTEC, whether it is BBIN, or organizations minus Pakistan. These are really quite important. One other area, of course, which I think we should be studying is the resistance to reform of international institutions. The one that Indians talk about all the time is the UN Security Council, but there is a resistance to reform within the WTO, or as you know, the Portuguese minister said yesterday, in order to change unanimity, you need unanimity, and that might be the problem in the Security Council. But we need to look at why there is so much resistance to reform, including from countries that are actually not beneficiaries of this system. And this applies as well domestically. Many of the issues of democracies that you referred to, you know, nationalism, protectionism, populism, all of these, they come out of a genuine gumming up of the institutions within which democracy functions. We really have to look at things like term limits for prime ministers. We have to look, even members of parliament, we have to look at how the election process proceeds, how it is that parties, and in India, dynasties dominate not just national politics, but also more and more state politics, and which means that they dominate political parties as well. Thank you.
Gustavo.
Hi, Jim. Okay, thank you. I am Gustavo Martinez. I come from Argentina. Before coming here, I had a meeting with my president and the executive committee of CARI, Argentine Council for International Relations, about what are going to be the dynamics or paradigms on where we're going to base our research. We taking into account the international society, what is happening in terms of security, economy, politics, and environment. We were discussing about at least four main dynamics. Obviously, the first is the competition between China and US in the commercial field and the technological field. The second is what kind of world we are. No? Is bipolar, multipolar, is dispolar. Take in account that we are in a world with more conflicts than consensus. The first is the rise of nationalist populism that is happening right now, for example, in my continent, with López Obrador in Mexico or Bolsonaro in Brazil. They have opposing ideological positions, but the way of governance is similar. And the fourth is the continuous displacement of the power from the West to the Asia Pacific. And how this is reflected in the relationship between Asia and Latin America. But I want to say that the relationship between Asia and Latin America is not a novel fact. I remember we organized in the 70s the non-alignment movement. It was a voice of developing countries. In that moment, there was a bipolar with two superpowers governing the world. So For us, it's very important the relationship between Argentina or Asia, Latin America and Asia, because we, for example, last year, we organized more side events. You know, we had the Argentine presidency, we had the G20 presidency, and my institution has the T20 presidency. And we organized more events with China, India, South Korea, and Japan more than our traditional partners, US and European Union. And I think that these partners, they didn't realize that about the importance of this relationship that means for us.
There's been discussion about that think tanks are generally elite institutions. There's been criticism in the West, certainly in terms of Britain, who needs experts, or we have enough ideas, we no longer need experts. Can each one of you talk a bit about the challenge of not only, and I think one of the fundamental changes that has taken place is that historically, and there are two dimensions to this. One is that historically the view of the role of think tanks is in the short term and long term. Question is that still true? And then secondly, the other assumption was that the principal audience or the sole audience of think tanks is policymakers. And in what we have seen in France, in the Philippines, in the United States, in Spain, etc., is the role of and the impact of mobilization of the public and its impact on elections and issues. So the question is it still true that the major focus of think tanks should be on the short term, midterm and long term, or do they have a role to play in trying to understand what the hell's happening in the streets, whether it's in Paris or in the Philippines or elsewhere? And the question is, associated with that from our colleagues from Asia, is the populism, this phenomenon of mass mobilization, something that will manifest itself in Asia? So one, do we now need to not only, as Cameron has suggested, think proactively and prospectively, but do we now also have to have some understanding of what's going on in the streets? Do we, as a part of that, have to understand and connect with the public as an important audience to engage them and communicate to them? And then will we see a wave of populism and these aspects manifest themselves in Asia? Yeah, we'll just start in the same order.
I think you've given us a number of binary choices, and my answer, of course, is yes. The answer, of course, is that what comes from a tradition of elitism, and let's look at the kind of organization that the East-West Institute is, or I think many of our others, where we were put together in the 20th century in order to serve the needs of elites, that is, to fill a gap where governments and other leaders couldn't fill in. We're more a do tank than a think tank. We do a lot of track 2, for example. These were things that are the tasks of elites. Just because we have the kinds of questions that James has raised doesn't mean we still don't need those elite kind of addresses. That said, the proliferation of think tanks, I believe, has to meet the kinds of questions that he's raised. How do we deal with the questions of popular mobilization in politics? How do we deal with the kinds of questions that don't lend themselves to a simple focus on an issue that can be given to a government? Transnational issues, from proliferation to climate change issues to the role of women in society to, say, in the Middle East, the role of economies after oil. These are all questions that go far beyond what an elite group of people can supply to an elite group of policymakers. So I think, yes, we are going to see a proliferation of groups. The question I think that's interesting for us is, what is then going to happen when the world of think tanks becomes less coherent, becomes broader, and maybe even begins to cross borders, where it stops being an Indian think tank, but a South Asian think tank or a Central Asian think tank, where you're serving the needs of addressing immediate issues that are political, such as the groups in Iran during the time of the so-called Green Revolution, who were independent groups but were actually in many ways seen as political parties. I think part of this is a question that we're going to have to deal with about the definition of a think tank, that it is going to become very, very diverse. And this ties into your second point, which is in an era of populism and in an era where the prospect that liberal democracy as a model is under fire, and that the attractiveness of so-called strongman governments is becoming something that really has to be dealt with. What does that question, not in an academic way, but in a practical way, mean for think tanks? Is it going to be as easy to put a think tank together in Erdogan's Turkey as it was in the past? Is it going to be as easy to put something together in Trump's America as it was in the past? That is, we're talking not only about analyzing these changes, but we're talking about the structure of our own organizations, both elite and common, that is going to be, I think, under change in an era of populism.
Well, I mean, in short, the answer to all your questions is yes, but I think it's important to understand that there's a huge amount of diversity in think tanks, right? You know, of course, there is a certain elitism in how think tanks engage, in the vocabulary they use, in the grammar of policy making. But at the same time, I don't think that if we are to consider ourselves as effective knowledge producers and as people who value evidence, argument, and knowledge first, then there's no question of being elite. I mean, how do you produce knowledge without understanding the context in which you are, without understanding from the top to the bottom how the society in which you're operating actually thinks and engages? And it's incumbent upon us to be able to ensure that both the means of knowledge production and the means of knowledge dissemination are done in ways that don't just limit themselves to closed doors, but done in ways that open themselves out to a variety of audiences. The challenge there, of course, that think tanks face, and I think the charge of elitism comes largely from that, is that we are either good academics who know how to speak to academics, or we are good policy practitioners who know how to speak the vocabulary of policy practice, but are not able to step out of those jargons and those vocabularies to talk to a wider audience in ways that are engaging for us as well. And I think that is where the charge of elitism comes from. And we've all been pushed, at least at CPR, we've been pushed very hard to start communicating, whatever that means. I think Twitter allows a certain kind of communication that is possibly a bit dangerous, but it is forcing people out to talk to people outside of their immediate communities. But I think thinking much more innovatively about communication is important. And maybe I think understanding that a very important role of the knowledge brokers, the knowledge producers, the ideators, is actually in being able to engage with ideas through public discourse. So and that automatically, I think, would force us to be able to engage in a dialogue much more effectively. Lastly, I think one of the really important things that a lot of think tanks don't do, and I'm quite proud to say that CPR does, and not out of design, but just given the nature of the work that we do, is that a lot of the research is anchored in partnerships with grassroots organizations. And I think that if there is one way to ensure that you really have your feet on the ground and your hands dirty, it is through those kinds of engagements. So thinking about research partnerships, not just as partnerships across universities or across think tanks, but thinking about partnerships across a whole diverse range of actors, for a lot of whom, in fact, research is very critical in their activism, will, I think, be a very important tool with which which there could be a much wider engagement across a much wider range of organizations and a much wider range of actors. So absolutely, the future of think tanks cannot be limited to rooms like this. The role that think tanks play is important and crucial, particularly in the context of a public and political discourse that is increasingly getting polarized. We have to be very careful, especially when there is a lot of push for think tanks to have a seat on the table and to engage with policymakers and to have policy impact, to understand what the implications of policy impact is on the ability to remain integral, rigorous to your research, and to ensure that evidence speaks first before ideologies kick in.
Yeah. No, I agree with a lot of what's already been said, but I think there is a danger that with the proliferation of think tanks into myriad organizations, increasingly also advocacy organizations, not always non-partisan, or special interest groups, there's a blurring of lines here that we're being pulled into this polarization. And we sort of think of ourselves as observers, dispassionate observers of what's happening, but actually we're also being pulled into it. And so we have to be careful. And this is actually why I go back to that first point that I made, which is I think we need to, in some sense, have a common definition and a common purpose. That can be a wide umbrella that allows for a variety of activities, but there is a need, I think, to think critically about what think tanks should do, what sorts of ideals we have in common, and I think, again, this fact-based research speaks first above anything. As to your question about short-term and long-term, I think we need to continue thinking long-term, particularly because that's now going against the grain with things being, with policy horizons having shrunk, and in this 24-hour news cycle, everything is just so short-term. I think one of the biggest assets, if we are thinking about filling the gap in policymaking, is bringing a long-term analysis. There is, I see a point to being relevant. A lot of think tanks nowadays think that being relevant is also just continuously being in the news, and that's a good sign of being out there in the public, of engaging with what's happening. But then I also see think tanks turning into increasingly journalistic outlets, doing running commentary and less research. So I think we also need to fight that instinct a little bit as well. Ultimately, how we regain the trust of the public at large is by diversifying how we communicate our long-form research. I worked for 2 years on a project called the Age of Power Index, where we in some sense try to demystify what an index is all about. Usually you produce an index and it's presented as a black box that spits out a magic number. The way that we built it was as an interactive website that was publicly available, in which users, anyone around the world, could disaggregate every level of the index and actually also bring their own weightings, their own assumptions to bear on the conclusions of the index, which would reshuffle the rankings. Why is that important? Because in one sense we're saying, here's research which is thought-provoking, which we think is interesting to you, but here we're also trying to democratize in some sense the act of thinking and coming to conclusions. And I think that's been very successful. So that's one area of long-form research where we're trying to in some way unpack what we're doing, what our assumptions are, and disaggregate the kind of fact-based data input from some of the value judgments we have to make in producing an index. And that goes for non-data-based research as well. The final point I want to make is on this issue of independence and a deficit of trust. I think that's obviously something that has hit Western institutions a lot, given the way that the political developments have evolved in the West. But Asian think tanks also face their own sets of issues, and those issues are to do with the constricted, well, in some cases, and in some countries, because we're obviously dealing with a huge region with a lot of diversity, but particularly in non-democratic countries, a constricted civil society space, where think tanks have evolved in a different model to the way that they've evolved in some of the countries in which they originated in the West. I feel that the primary purpose of many think tanks in authoritarian governments has been about ensuring consistency of domestic debate with government objectives, as platforms for advertising government objectives abroad, and as a way of immunizing countries from foreign influence. So I think I think those are also things which, in some sense, can compromise independence, intellectual independence, and will also probably come back to haunt those institutions in terms of a trust deficit on the part of their publics. So we do have to be a bit more open. It's two sets of challenges, but they are challenges nonetheless.
Nilam and Gustavo, do you have anything to add? And then I want to open it up to the audience for questions.
Sorry, I would just like to say that how long-term you can be and how much you can disseminate depends on your resources, the size of an institution, how much funding, and also in India and in many other countries, I think, the additional complication of language. Many think tanks in India produce their output in English, but only some are able to translate it. And many issues in India which deserve much deeper study than they get, then need to be done and disseminated in a local language rather than the other thing. And I think that there has to be some recognition that think tanks should not displace media, because then we are going to have a problem. All think tanks have their output as op-eds in the mainstream media, and that's fine and good for the think tank, but it does crimp journalists and analysts in many really fundamental ways.
Okay. Gustavo?
Okay, very shortly. In terms of capacity of influence of governments, of the think tanks on the public policies, I think that could be happening in Asia or Europe, but it doesn't happen in Argentina or Latin America. We are in the 7th place in terms of number of think tanks in your ranking, sorry. But really, I don't know how many of them are really influenced in politics, because I think it's because of our governments, because they doesn't rely on the manage on think tanks, the complicity in different terms. So I think we have to change this, because it's a cultural question. So we need time. So I think in a long term.
Okay. So I'm going to give the panel a question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience for their questions, just to prepare you for that. What is your sense of the state of think tanks in Asia and their ability to help shape the Asian century? Questions from the audience? One here and one over there. Are there mics anywhere? Oh yeah, here we go. And then over there. So 1, 2, 3, 4.
My name is Dr. Sharma. My question is that to what extent the think tanks have been able to influence the government policy making, except the one we have in China, which is a government-owned think tank? If not, or yes, what should be the road ahead for the think tanks to be involved with the government's policy making?
Okay. Yeah, I'll take 4 questions. Next one right behind. Okay. So we'll come to you. We'll work across the room.
Yeah. Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Okay. Well, since you've seized the mic, ask your question.
Okay. So my name is Tirthanka Goyal. It was a very impressive discussion. I would like to know, my question is to all the panelists, although nobody is there from the European Union. I'm working between Paris, Israel, and New Delhi, and I have observed there are plenty of think tank in Brussels. And lot of time they have been talking about influencing the policy in India. And so I would like to know the opinion from all the panelists that up to the what extent it is true. Thank you very much.
Okay. We have a question over here and a question there. Since you're in the proximity right here, yeah, and then we'll come to you.
My question is, if you can prioritize for us who think tanks serve. So it often appears to me as an external observer that think tanks are sort of very interested in how other think tanks think about them. Do you really serve the public? Do you really serve the government? Or why is there this tendency to, if I may say so, impress each other?
Okay. We'll try to do 2 rounds.
I had an exchange with a very retired senior theater commander of the US Navy, who surprised me when I asked him as to how did the US land up making serious strategic mistakes over the last 10, 15 years when you got a plethora of think tanks assisting you in your decision making. And the answer he gave was, there is not one think tank in Washington that is not driven by political agenda. And there is nobody...
Not driven by...
Political agenda.
Okay.
So from here emerges the question, in democracies, how would policymakers really bank on your data, since statistics can be presented in the way that you desire? Yamini pointed out to a whole host of issues that India currently faces. My suggestion to think tanks in India would be those that are dealing with policy related to Indian governance issues. The vacuum is really at the middle and lower level bureaucracy. The senior policymakers and the politicians understand the desired end state, but it is the intermediate and lower level who either don't know or don't care. And therefore, you might have to look at serious core issues on how to deal with them. You might gain better traction. Thank you.
So I don't, not necessarily that everyone has to answer every question. Do I have volunteers? Okay.
Let me just take the last one first. There's absolutely no doubt that the middle and lower bureaucracy in India is struggling and very weak. And in fact, but I would push back against assuming that that problem is only there and the top knows what it's doing. Because if the top is making policies that are not able to strengthen the middle and the lower, something's pretty wrong at the top too. Having said that, this is something that we are quite aware of and in our work are trying to engage with quite a lot. There's a number of initiatives within CPR that actively work with district level administrations and lower than district local level administrations proactively, both supporting them with research as well as sharing ideas. And I think that we are one of the few who do it. Far more people need to do this. And that is one of the biggest things. Perhaps more think tanks need to engage with state administrative training centers to be able to work better with district and local bureaucracies. To the other 2 questions, who do think tanks serve and why do think tanks spend all their time trying to impress each other? Well, I mean, at some level, it's always nice to impress your peers, right? It doesn't matter whether you're think tanks or academics or anybody. It's always good to impress your peers and to be part of that community. But I really don't think that think tanks are limited at all by any desire just to impress each other. I think think tanks spend perhaps almost too much time trying to impress policymakers. And in fact, who we really serve should be thought of much broader as the wider public. We serve the knowledge we serve the expertise and the knowledge communities that we are part of, the nature of the knowledge that we build, and we use that knowledge to engage and serve the public. I think that is the role that think tanks have to play, and that's where think tanks are, at least mine, and I think a lot of my peers sitting on this dais most certainly are attempting to serve and engage with. On this question of influencing of policy, this is a question that all think tanks grapple with constantly. Some think tanks describe themselves, in fact, not even as think tanks, as do tanks, because they actively see themselves as playing a role in engaging with policy. Within my institution, we've had a very, very vibrant conversation about what it means. And let me just put it to you this way. I think the challenge that think tanks and, in fact, all non-state actors that are engaging with government, by which I mean NGOs and other such and not the other non-state actors, that are actively engaged with trying to strengthen government, make government more participatory, make government more responsive. The question that always confronts you is, should you become the government or not? And I think that the role that we have to play is not to make policy. I would be quite worried if I were to be, if anything that I have, if in my work I'm sitting on the table actually drafting policy, because then I should have a very different job. I'm not qualified to make policy. I am certainly qualified to present my expertise on the table and ensure that my policymakers have the knowledge that they need to be able to make choices. Ultimately, policy making is an active act of politics. It is not an act of technocracy. We have to recognize that. Technocrats have a critical role in placing expertise on the table, because without that, the politics may not have the tools it needs to make the right sets of decisions. So I leave it at that.
Okay. Any other responses quickly?
I would like just to ask the question of whether think tanks are supposed to inform, not necessarily influence. That's the traditional definition. So then I don't think, and then we have to keep in mind the limitation that think tankers are elite as the government politician or the bureaucracy that they're trying to influence. So actually maybe what we need is think tanks in provinces, state governments, provincial places. And I don't know how well, I mean, mine is not the kind of think tank which works at the grassroots level in any way, since we do global relations. But I think then here we are again, I mean, all lines are getting blurred, but we are blurring the lines between what NGOs do and what think tanks did.
Okay. Quickly, very quick intervention, and then I'm going to open for more questions and then close.
I mean, on the core purpose, I think you're right. I think the first thing about think tanks is to inform. Then there's a convening role as well. And then there is, I think, also room for influence. But we perhaps need to be more transparent about what qualifies as sort of a fact-based, this is the reality as we see it, and then a more policy prescriptive agenda. And I think think tanks can do all those things, but we need to be clear about what we're doing, and when we're doing it. When it comes to DC think tanks, I have not worked in DC myself. I've been there a few times, but my understanding is that think tanks in the US are much more operate along a revolving door basis of people coming in and out of government. That doesn't necessarily hold for all governments, for all think tanks, even in other Western countries. So the political agenda there, I think varies country by country. There are international affairs think tanks that are truly non-partisan, insofar as they have many views under one roof. I think, well, I'll leave it at that, and then I think we'll move to the next round.
Quickly?
Yeah, very short. In our institution, we say always that we give opinion, we don't influence, at least directly. But in Argentina and Latin America, the independence is an issue, because governments, they don't understand that you are independent, that you can think different in some topics, but they consider that as a I can't remember when you say you are the enemy. You are the enemy. So it's very difficult to work in that way.
All right. Any additional questions in the way in the back there, and then we need a mic.
Could I just intervene?
In a lighter vein, there is a popular saying that the Washington DC has more think tanks than the British Army has got tanks. So my point is, I am Major P.K. Malik, retired. I've got a army background. When we used to go for any counter-insurgency operations, we were told, where is the money? So when the think tanks, where is the money? The money is coming from some funds. It may be organization, maybe individuals, but the think tank people cannot go beyond certain limits where the interest of that particular organization or the person clashes with the findings of that particular study or something. Second is, say a report has come from Heritage. I will see that report with a particular tinge. So how do the think tanks can get over these things, because money is a factor, funding is a factor. And my question is if I read Guardian today, they ask, after reading you say, you can give me $1, but it will help us in funding things. So is there any think tank existing which is solely run by crowdsourcing or crowdfunding or something like that? Second question I want to ask my Indian representatives on the dais.
Great, thank you. Is there a final point to the question?
The second question is that, from the security background, you'll find that all the reports which come are very subjective in nature. There are very little, the technologies that is available, the statistics, quality control, whatever, this is not available. So my point is, about your think tanks and all, do you have those things, like big data analytics and all in your reports? And how much this government take your reports seriously? Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll make a few comments while the panel prepares for the final lightning round of responses in terms of the assessment of the state of think tanks in Asia to prepare the region for the challenges that lie ahead. In terms of, I often cite a quote by Plato that said, "No good government until philosophers are kings and kings are philosophers." In terms of, and part of one of the challenges, the age-old challenge with think tanks is understanding and having an appreciation of the needs of policymakers and making what they produce in a language and in a form that is accessible not only to policymakers but the public. And that is directly connected to however you define influence and impact. And there is a continuing discussion around the think tanks need to have a greater impact. That is in part driven by the fact that there are many more actors who are competing for the same space and attention of policymakers, and that creates demands around funding, which was referenced in the last question of, what is the value? What is your contribution based on the investment that is made in institutions? I believe that think tanks are very indispensable, but need to make some fundamental change. In terms of accessibility, 2/3 of all of the papers that are posted in PDF form on the World Bank's website are never downloaded. And so the content, there's not a problem with the content. The central point, which is a challenge for all think tanks, is how do you deliver the content? The mission of think tanks in the future will not change. Its key purpose will be to provide innovative ideas and research on key policy issues. What must change is how that is, what products are produced by think tanks, in what form do they produce those ideas, possibly not in PDF, and then what audiences they communicate what they produce to. So I now turn to the panel for their assessment of what the state of think tanks in Asia and how they are preparing Asia for the Asia Center.
Two very quick points, and they have to do actually with this funding question. First of all, what I would exhort the people in Asian countries to do is to pay very close attention to the laws that govern the structure of think tanks. In America, this is governed by the tax law, and the ability of people to give money and the ability of organizations, say like my own, to be able to fight back, to say, you can give me this money, but you cannot tell me what to think. This is something that is a battle. It has to do with faith and has to do with that argument about whether everything is objective or not. It's not always objective, but there is an ideal that the law allows you the protection that a funder cannot make you do something. And I would say this is one key thing throughout Asia. as countries grapple with this, that they think hard about whether culturally within their particular countries they can protect that. Secondly, the point is that when you talk about effect, remember that think tanks have many functions. I think we talked about the convening function. There's more than just writing a paper. There's the means by which people bring others together, the means by which you choose to bring other people together to try to to disseminate that information. The means our organization uses to actually engage in such things as track 2 discussions, where there's no product, there's no website for someone not to read. There's a question of whether we have people within Lebanon who are talking to one another. So there is a very diverse point, a diverse set of things that think tanks do, and as Asian countries try to think about how they make a incubator for those, they should think hard, I hope, that there is not a one-size-fits-all for think tanks.
Okay.
Just to pretty much endorse what has already been said, I think the question of funding is crucial and is going to shape the future of think tanks in Asia. Certainly in India, domestic philanthropy is still very much at its nascent phase, and I think there's a space for a conversation between those who are in need of funds, like the think tanks, as well as those who would want to involve themselves in philanthropy around ideas, to really talk about how one addresses the challenge of ensuring that funding is provided in a manner that creates a Chinese wall between the funder and the thinking. That's a process that is still very much in evolution, and I think this is an opportunity to shape it and influence it in ways that are productive going forward. I think the second really critical issue is about engaging in a public debate. Of course, it is important to bear in mind what Neelam had said. One doesn't want to undermine the core central role that think tanks play, which is that of being researchers, as being knowledge producers, but it is important to think about how one can take knowledge and engage with a diverse set of audiences. Technology enables this. I think increasingly now, beyond op-eds, there's a much wider set of things that can be done. It's a nascent field, but again, a field in which a lot of new thinking and fresh ideas can emerge. Lastly, I think specifically, at least in the context of India, 2 unique challenges. One challenge comes from the nature of the university system, which is not necessarily creating a pipeline of thinkers. How does one engage with that to be able to both create a new generation of thinkers as well as a generation of thinkers that aren't only thinking with each other but also thinking with the policy community? How do you think about how public policy is taught? It's a very important role that we in the present are going to have to play in order to strengthen think tanks and other policy institutions going forward. And lastly, this question of how do you move away from the city centers, how do you move away from rooms like this, from Delhi, from Mumbai, from Calcutta, to engage in more robust conversations around creation of knowledge and engagement at the state level and below. And of course, think tanks are different to NGOs, but I do think that think tanks, especially domestic policy think tanks that are working on issues like health and education, some of the work that we do at CPR, does have an important role to play in interacting with the local government as well. We never actually think of taking our research outside of places like this and sharing them with district administrators and block administrators who are actually implementing the programs that we study. Doing more of that will have a dramatic shift in the way the state functions, I think.
Okay. I'm going to have to bring it to a close. I have
Time's
the
up.
hook and hands waving at me that we have to bring this to a close. I want to thank all of the panelists for their contribution. And the value of this, I think, for me, was illustrated in terms of this type of engagement. I was sitting at the table and a gentleman said to me, which in terms of these larger discussions, what is the Washington consensus? And these discussions here prompted that question from him, which is important because it means that people are now being engaged in a deeper level. I hope that we were able to engage all of you and a greater understanding of think tanks and the role that they can play in the Asian century, and I want to thank all of you for your contributions.